Perfect. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Utilities 2023 Load Impact Protocol Final Reports Workshop. The meeting today will be from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. So a few logistics before we get started. This meeting will be posted online as it will be recorded, and they will be uploaded to the DR Workshops website, which at the end of my opening, I will post in the chat. I am your host, Andrew McGee, and you can contact me at andrew.mcgee, that is M-A-G-I-E, at cpuc.ca.gov. And if you are having any technical issues, please reach out to Xizhen Zhang, that is Xzhang, at appliedenergygroup.com. Now for safety, please note the surroundings and emergency exits in your area, and also take a moment to have an ergonomic check to keep your computer screen up near where your eye level is, and try to keep your body in a comfortable upright position. If you are having any emergency, please immediately call 911, or you can use the chat function and we will call 911 for you to get you the help that you need. Everyone is muted at the beginning of this workshop, and if you have any questions, please use the raise your hand function. This just looks like a hand that says raise beneath it, and we will allow you to unmute yourself, and then you can ask your questions. Also, if you would rather type, you may use the chat function, and we will read your questions aloud. Remember, once you have been unmuted and you have asked your question, please mute back. The ground rules for today. This workshop is structured to allow utilities to present the results of their LIP reports and engage questions on methods, ex post, and ex ante results. Please keep your questions friendly and respectful, and use the chat feature only for questions or technical issues. Do not start or respond to sidebar conversations in the chat. You can send direct messages, though, to people directly by right-clicking on their name. The agenda for today, we will be going over 4 of the Load Impact Protocol reports. Firstly will be PG&E's Smart AC program, which will start when I am done in a couple minutes. SDG&E's AC Saver Day Ahead program, which will start at 10. SDG&E's AC Saver Day Of program, which will start at 11. And finally, SCE's Summer Discount program at 11:45. And with that, I will pass the mic over to PG&E to present their Smart AC.
Okay, thanks, Andrew, for the introduction. I will go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone see the slides?
Yep, they look great.
Okay, thanks. So today I'll be talking about load impacts evaluation for PG&E's Smart AC program. And my name is Sherry Wang. This is a joint work with Corey Lott. We are from Christensen Associates Energy Consulting. So in today's presentation, first I will briefly describe what is the Smart AC program. And then in the second part, I'm going to talk about ex post, including the methodology, the load impacts, and the plan versus actual device swap-outs. In the third part, I'm going to talk about ex ante, which includes the methodology, enrollment forecast, and ex ante load impacts. And finally, I will conclude with recommendations. So first, what is the Smart AC program? So the Smart AC program in PG&E is a direct load control AC cycling program for residential customers. When customers sign up for this program, they receive one-time incentive. And upon enrollment, a device is installed on the customer's AC unit. So basically, during an event, this device, PG&E can send a signal to this device. And when a signal is received, the device will cycle the participant's AC unit compressor at a 50% duty cycle. This means that for approximately 50 minutes of a 30-minute period, the customer's AC unit compressor will not produce cool air. And customers can choose to opt out of specific Smart AC events. The Smart AC program was integrated into the Kaisel wholesale market in program year 2018. And the events can be up to 6 hours per day from May to October. There are two distinct types of events. One is called sublab events. The other one is called serial number events. In the sublab events, all customers within a sublab are dispatched. While in the serial number events, a random sample of all Smart AC customers are dispatched. And since the Smart AC program was integrated into the Kaisel wholesale market, sublab events have become a source of value to PG&E from Kaisel market awards. So currently, most events dispatched in the Smart AC programs are actually sublab events. So next, let's look at how many people are actually enrolled in the Smart AC programs. So in May 2022, there are about 74,000 customers enrolled in the Smart AC program, and among these customers, so about 6,400 are also duly enrolled in the Smart Rate program. We have talked about there will be a device installed on the customer's AC unit, and there are two different types of devices: the one-way devices and two-way devices. The one-way device was the legacy technology. So basically, for one-way devices, they're only capable of receiving the signal from PG&E. Well, for two-way devices, they can not only receive the signal, but they can only confirm they have received the signal and also confirm the equipment status. And the CPUC has approved the swap out of remaining one-way devices for two-way devices by 2024. And starting from 2024, the enrollment in the Smart AC program will be closed. So next, I will move on to the ex-post. First, I will briefly describe the methodology we use for ex-post evaluation. So we use a match control group plus difference in differences approach. In the matching process, the goal is to find control customers that are as similar as possible to Smart AC customers in terms of characteristics and hourly load profiles. Due to the high number of potential control customers, we use a two-stage matching process to make the matching process more tractable. In the first stage, we identify 3 potential matches for each Smart AC customers using all potential control customers. And the matching is based on average monthly usage, weather station, the cooling degree days, and other customer characteristics. And after the first stage, we will select one Smart AC customer from we'll select one Smart AC customers for each, we'll select one control customer for each Smart AC customers, and from the control customer is selected from the pared down set of selected controls from the first stage. And in this matching, we use propensity score matching using interval load data for non-event days and also other customer characteristics. For the interval load data, we use 2 24-hour average load profiles on hot days and also cooler days. We use the load profiles to take into account the weather sensitivity of customers' electricity usage. And the matching is segmented by sublab and also by similar rate schedules. Once we have selected control customers, we run our difference in differences model to control for the remaining differences between the treatment customers and the control customers. And in the regression model, we also allow the relationship between weather and loads to vary by AC usage level. So this table shows the information of all the Smart AC events this year, including the date, the Smart Rate event, whether it's a Smart Rate event, and the reason for dispatch, the event hours, the sublabs or serial groups dispatched, and the number of customers dispatched. There are in total 16 events on 14 event days, and 12 of the events are Kaisel Market Awards. 2 of the events are zero test events which is one is on August 17th and the other one is on September 6th. There are also 2 emergency events. You notice that the 2 emergency events are on the same day as another preceding events. And also there's a small time gap between the emergency event and the preceding events. So this makes the emergency event partial hour events. And when we present the results for average event hour load impacts by events, we only show the full event hours and we do not show partial hour events. So in the next slides, when I present the average event hour load impacts for each event, I won't be presenting the results for the emergency events. And among all the event days, so there are 8 event days that are also smart rate event days. In a smart AC and smart rate dual event, we do not include the duly enrolled customers who are enrolled in both smart AC and smart rate in the number of customers dispatched or in the load impacts calculation, because this is to avoid double counting, as the load impacts for those customers are typically attributed to the smart rate program. So this figure shows the average event hour load impacts by event. And the gold bars here shows the load impacts for zero events. The blue bars here shows the load impacts for sublab events. And the green band shows the 80% confident interval around the estimates. The orange line here shows the average event hour temperature. So overall, the load impacts are from 0.13 to 0.36 kilowatt hour per customer per hour. And the drivers of this variation of load impacts are, first, there are different sublabs code. Second, there are different event temperatures. And third, the events are on different hours of the day. And notice that the zero event on September 6th, the load impacts actually is lower than the zero event in program year 2020 with a similar temperature. And the main reason for this is the dispatch issues we have this year for two-way devices. And I will explain the dispatch issues in more details when I compare this year's expose with last year's expose. So just to illustrate what is the hourly load profile like on an event day, here I show the sublab event on September 7, 2022. In this event, so there are about 97% of customers are dispatched. And the event is from 4 to 8 p.m. The green line here shows the estimated aggregate hourly load impacts. The orange line here shows the observed hourly aggregate load. And the blue line is the sum of the two, which is the estimated hourly aggregate load. Sorry, the estimated hourly reference load. And the gray line here shows the hourly temperature. So in this event, the peak load impacts is 23.3 megawatt hour per hour, which occurs during the second hour of the event. And average per customer load impacts is 0.31 kilowatt hour per customer per hour. So in the next 2 slides, I'm going to compare this year's expose result with last year's expose and also last year's ex-ante forecast. So in program year 2021 and 2022, 8 sublabs were dispatched in both program years. So this table shows the comparison for the common sublabs, including the number of customers dispatched, the reference load, the per customer load impacts, the aggregate load impacts, and the average temperature. The aggregate load impacts are 33% lower in this program year. And this is due to several reasons. First, so there are like over 8,100 fewer customers dispatched, mainly due to program attrition. And also there's lower per customer load impacts in this program year. And one reason for the lower per customer load impacts is that the temperature is like about 5 degrees cooler. And the other reason is two-way customers dispatch issue. I'll just give you a bit more detail on the dispatch issue. So basically, on average, there are about 41% of the over 13,000 two-way customers have dispatch issues. And at a sub-lab level, the percentage is from 28% to 57%. So PGEB, PGF1, and PGFSD have the highest share of two-way customers that have dispatch issue. And the dispatch issues reduce the average load impacts from 0.6 to 0.36 kilowatt hour per customer per hour. So in this slide, I'm comparing this year's ex-post with last year's ex-ante forecast. For this year's ex-post, I'm using the system-wide event on September 5th. So first, let's compare the ex-post result with PG&E 1 in 2 scenario on July peak day, because PG&E 1 in 2 scenario is the scenario that used in resource planning and resource adequacy. So you can see here that the average event hour temperature and the average daily temperature are lower compared to the ex-post, but the per customer load impacts are comparable between the ex-ante and ex-post. So to get a more comparable temperature, we also here include the PG&E 1 in 10 scenario on July peak day from last year's ex-ante forecast. And you can see that if you look at the aggregate load impacts, so the aggregate load impacts in ex-post is 28% lower. And this is because first, the enrollment is over 3,000 lower. Well, the temperatures are pretty similar. They're only slightly lower. But the per customer load impacts is 0.11 kilowatt hour per customer per hour lower. And this is because of first, the two-way device dispatch issues that I discussed in the last slide. And second is because in ex-post, there are fewer devices. There are fewer two-way devices because there are fewer two-way device swap out than assumed in last year's forecast. So in last year's forecast, it was assumed that about 29% of devices will be two-way devices, but in ex-post, there's only 20% two-way devices. So this figure shows the comparison of the planned versus actual device exchanges and new device installation of two-way devices from January 2022 to November 2022. So the blue bars shows the planned device exchanges, and the orange bar shows the planned new device installation. So you can see that there are fewer two-way devices actually installed in 2022 than planned. So there are about 8,000 fewer swap outs of one-way devices for two-way devices, and there are about 2,200 fewer new customers recruited. And the main reasons of the discrepancies are, first, there's shortage of technicians. And second, there are higher number than anticipated number of customers that declined to have a device swap out or they were not reachable. So next, I will move on to the ex-ante. And just as last year, this year's ex-ante forecast, we take into account of device swap outs. And this figure here shows the planned device swap out for 2023 from PG&E. And the orange line here shows there will be about 250 new customers enrolled per month. And the blue lines here shows there will be about 1,400 to 2,100 device swap outs per month. And the orange line here shows the sum of the two. And all the device swap outs will be completed by 2024. And in the ex-ante forecast, we develop separately for one-way and two-way devices the per customer load impacts. So how did we do that? So we first run a regression of ex-post per customer load impacts as a function of weather, hour, sublab, and the serial event indicator. And so the data we use are from ex-post load impacts in program year 2020, 2021, and 2022. And in the regression, the load impacts from 2020 and 2021 are given twice the weight as the load impacts for this year. So the forecast reflects some level of two-way device operational issues, but we assume that most of the impacts of 2022 dispatch issues will be resolved by 2023. And once we have the regression parameters, we combine that with the ex-ante weather scenarios to produce the per customer load impacts separately for one-way and two-way devices. And then the load impacts by device type are combined to make an average per customer load impacts based on the relative share of two-way devices that is from the PG&E's enrollment forecast. And we developed the reference load for each month, sublab, and enrollment segment using regressions of per customer hourly usage as a function of weather and load shape variables. The data we use are PG&E's Smart AC customers' hourly usage data, non-holiday weekdays, and non-event days. And we then combine the parameters obtained from the regression with ex-ante weather data and day type characteristics. So this figure shows the enrollment forecast by LCA from 2023 to 2033. The enrollment number in July each year is shown above the chart. So you can see that the enrollment decreased slightly in 2023, but there's a dramatic drop in enrollment in January 2024. This is because PG&E assumes that 29,500 customers with one-way devices will be de-enrolled from the Smart AC program. So those customers were either declined to have a device swap out, or they were not reachable, or they had incompatible technology. And then the enrollments decline over the remainder of the forecast. This is because of two reasons. So first, as I mentioned in the introduction slide, so the new enrollment in Smart AC program will be closed. And second, also because of program attrition. So this figure shows the aggregate RA window load impacts from 4 to 9 p.m. by LCA for PG&E's 1 in 2 July peak scenario from 2023 to 2033. So you can see that there's a large decline in load impacts, and the decline is about 39% from July 2023 to July 2024. And that is because there's a 46% drop in enrollments. The reason why the decline for the aggregate load impacts are less than the drop in enrollment is because in 2024, all customers will be two-way customers, so they have higher per customer load impacts. And then after 2024, the aggregate load impacts decreased by 9.5% per year, which is consistent with the decline of enrollment I presented in the last slide. So in the next two slides, I'm going to compare this year's ex-ante result with this year's ex-post, as well as last year's ex-ante. So in this table here, we show this year's ex-post result for all sublab events by device type, as well as for all customers. And for the ex-ante, we show PG&E 1 in 2 scenario on July peak day for both forecast year 2023 and forecast year 2024. So first, let's compare the result for all customers in ex-post with the ex-ante. And you can see that both average event temperature and average daily temperature are lower in the ex-ante forecast. But the per customer load impacts is only 0.32 kilowatt hour per customer per hour in ex-post, which is lower than the ex-ante forecast. Next, let's compare within the forecast for 2023 and 2024. you can see that the per customer load impacts is higher in 2023 than 2024 because all devices will be two-way devices in 2024. And finally, let's compare the exposed result for two-way devices and the forecast for 2024. And you can see that the per customer load impacts in 2024 are higher than the per customer load impacts of two-way devices in exposed this year because we expect improvement in dispatch issues. So in this slide, we compare last year's ex-ante result with this year's ex-ante result for both forecast year 2023 and 2024. And the scenario we use is PG&E 1-in-2 scenario on July peak day. So if we compare within the same forecast year, you can see that the temperatures are lower in this year's forecast. This is because PG&E updated their weather scenario this year. And also you can see that the per customer load impacts are lower in this year within the same forecast year. And this is first because of the lower temperatures, and second because lower two-way device performance this year. And if we compare the aggregate load impacts, they are lower, of course, first because of the lower per customer load impact, but also because of fewer customers fewer forecasts enrollment in this year's forecast. And now if we compare just within last year's forecast and this year's forecast for 2023 and 2024, we'll see that there's an increase in per customer load impacts between 2023 and 2024 because of the completion of device swap out. So finally, I will conclude with the recommendations. So we recommend we continue to have system-wide and serial events code in isolation for the purpose of load impact estimation. And we also recommend continue to dispatch events over a variety of temperature so that in ex-ante we can produce more robust forecast models. And we have an additional recommendation going forward to dispatch some Smart AC only events in isolation so that we can analyze the difference between Smart AC only and duly enrolled customers. So with that, that concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions if you have. Well, if there are no questions, so thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, hearing no questions, we will move on to SDG&E's AC Saver Day Ahead program.
Hello, can folks hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Hi, yeah, so I'm Alana Lamar-Shawn with Demand Side Analytics. We are the evaluator for SDG&E's AC Saver Day Ahead program. We've been evaluating it since 2017 on the non-residential side and since 2019 on the residential side. So we'll be covering both components today. And so first we'll give a little overview of the program, then we'll go through the ex-post methodology and results for the residential program. There were no non-residential events this year. Then we'll cover the enrollment forecast, the ex-ante methodology, and then the ex-ante results, in which we'll do a comparison with what results were last year. So first on the non-residential side, so AC Saver Day Ahead is a smart thermostat load control program. And it originated on the non-residential side. It was originally small commercial technology deployment program being dispatched between 2 to 6 p.m. That was kind of rolled out in parallel with the rollout of time of use rates on the non-residential side. It then basically evolved into 2 different programs. For thermostats for customers on critical peak pricing rates, and then for a separate program for those that were not on dispatchable rates. And so that's sort of broken into there's a non-residential and then quasi-residential programs, and that's what we'll be focusing on today on the non-residential side. The events are typically dispatched between 6 to 8 p.m., but they can be dispatched in a variety of windows, but typically it's 6 to 8 p.m. In the right-hand side here, you can see sort of over the past 3 years, what were the number of sites enrolled. So on the non-residential side in 2020, there were just under 400. That increased to 660 last year because of the rollout of the community choice aggregation in city of San Diego and elsewhere. Some customers were rolled onto those that were on CPP rates could no longer be there. So some got rolled onto AC Saver Day Ahead. And then in this past year, there was a decline in enrollment due to disenrollment of sites that are inactive over a long period of time. First, I think the process was 2 years. Now it's 1 year. Basically, thermostats that are not active get disenrolled. And sort of a similar thing on the for quasi-res, there were a substantial number of thermostats that were really legacy thermostats that were essentially enrolled in that first time period between 2014 and 2017, and they were essentially had become inactive, and so those were disenrolled in the last couple of years. Just over a dozen quasi-residential sites. And the other key thing to see here is that there have been no events this year or last year, actually. So the last time there were non-residential AC Saver Day Ahead events was in 2020. So that is what we ended up using for the ex ante results. And on the residential side, a little bit of a similar story where in terms of taxonomy for the program, where there was essentially, an original program where there were free thermostats, in part of the rollout of reduced use peak time rebate, again, where there was a 2 to 6 p.m. dispatch window. And the free thermostat program essentially got evolved into a bring your own thermostat program, which is what it is today. There are still some free thermostat participants in the program, but essentially since 2018, the thermostat and new enrollments have all been bring your own thermostats, so rebated thermostats. And today we'll be sharing the aggregate results across the 2 of these, but you can kind of see just in terms of the mix of participants, back in 2019, there were about 7,000 free thermostats and about 10,000 bring your own thermostats. And since then, the enrollment has increased for the bring your own thermostat as that program gets rolled out, and free has decreased either with disenrollments or sometimes participants actually purchase a rebated thermostat, and so then they get transitioned into the BYOT program. And currently there are about 17,000 thermostats in the program. So as I mentioned before, there were no non-residential events, and so we do not have an ex post analysis to share there. We will be leveraging for the ex ante analysis the ex post results from 2020, but there is no ex post results to share on the non-residential side. On the residential side, as I mentioned, there are about 17,000 participants. We use the summer program data for that. We used a control pool of about 10,000 non-participants that were sampled and that we actually use each year. We screened these for ELRP participation this year. As you probably know, Power Saver Rewards or residential ELRP was rolled out this past year, and there was a good amount of customers who were defaulted, so we made sure to, so we took a look at that. In terms of segmentation, we looked at things both, by whether or not a customer was on a time of use rate, what their climate zone was, coastal versus inland, and whether they were on that free or BYOT program, and also by solar status. So we looked at things individually there. And in terms of the estimation method, so we used matching to develop the match control, and I'll get into how we did that in a second. And then we used the match control to, we used a difference in differences approach to, like a simple difference in differences to simply calculate what the effects were. And so in terms of the matching approach, we actually used an out of sample process and assessed multiple potential models for determining the best performing matched control group. So first of all, we split the data into testing and training days. We basically identified non-event proxy days with very similar system loads to the event days, and we divided those into two groups, testing and training, calculated load characteristics for the proxy days for participants and control. We actually tested 8 different matching models, 4 propensity score matching models, and 4 Euclidean distance matching models, specifying different combinations of load characteristics and hard matching criteria for each of those. For example, we made sure to match sites with solar to participant sites with solar to control sites with solar, for example. And then we ran the matching model method for each of those 8 models using the training data, leaving out the testing days. And then we essentially calculated out of sample bias and precision using the testing days, identified the 5 closest control sites, and calculated error for each participant relative to their control, and calculated goodness of fit. We used that to identify the best performing model, narrowing it first to models with the least bias, calculating the average precision using RMSE, and picking the model with the best precision. And finally, what we did to estimate loads or load reductions during actual events using the selected matching method. So we used the matches that was best performing using this out of sample process. In terms of estimating the actual impacts, we used a difference in differences calculation, so a simple difference in differences. And this slide just demonstrates that process. So on proxy days, so you can see in the left-hand panel here, you're controlling comparing the treatment group in blue to the matched controls in gray. And you can see there are they're pretty well matched, but there are slight differences here. On the average weekday event day for events that took place between 6 to 8, you can see again here the treatment in blue and the controls in gray, and you can see a clear impact here. And then the actual impacts that we reported netted out the difference on those baseline days, essentially on the proxy days. And so you can see in the right-hand panel here, the treatment, that adjusted baseline with that difference in difference adjustment, and the resulting impacts with uncertainty. Now, in terms of the results for each individual event, so there were nine events, those that you see here. We've actually grouped them by event window because there are a few different event windows since it can kind of float for this program, as I mentioned earlier. The primary event window that we reported was 6 to 8 p.m. So it's these events here. But as you can note, they all but one occurred in August, and a substantial heat wave, as I'm sure everybody here knows, was experienced that first week of September. And you can just see that both the loads and the load impacts were kind of progressively higher. And so we also reported the average for the 5 to 9 p.m. event, because those two events occurred on the 7th and 8th of September. So during that substantial heat wave. Another thing to point out here is that the event on August 17th, you can see that the load reductions were quite a bit lower. And the reason for that is that there was a dispatch issue. And so that where not all thermostats were able to be dispatched. And so that event is excluded from the average results. So here we have a split out of the results by those various segmentation parameters that I mentioned earlier. And so you can see there's actually relatively consistent reductions on a percentage basis when you split things out, even though the actual reference loads can vary quite a bit. For example, reference loads for customers on net metering tend to be quite a bit lower, but on a percentage basis, the reductions are relatively comparable, a little bit higher inland. And we also summarize things not only as a percentage of the whole building load, but also as a percentage of estimated cooling load. So we do an analysis where we identify the weather sensitive or the component of the load using historical loads and the component that is not weather sensitive. And if you subtract that part out, that is the inferred cooling load. And that is actually a key input into the ex ante analysis, as you'll see in a moment. Because we have noted over time with this program, you saw as the populations kind of dropped and changed quite a bit year to year. We've noticed that understanding not only what the overall average reductions are, but the reductions per connected thermostat are important as you have that population of connected thermostats. The portion that are connected change over time. And if you have a substantial portion, for example, that are disconnected, those thermostats are going to be diluting your reductions because thermostats that are not connected do not receive signals or produce reductions. And on the BYOT side, there's actually a pretty consistent reductions between free thermostats and BYOT. In prior years, there were perhaps more free thermostats that were disconnected. Those have since been migrated off of the program, and here we're ending up with reductions that are actually comparable between the two. And I guess the other thing to say is it's important to look at things in terms of reductions on a percentage basis, because, for example, coastal customers have lower reference loads because they tend to use less air conditioning. But when you look at reductions in terms of a percent of the load or percent of the cooling load, they're actually more similar.
Hey, Alana.
Yes.
You might. I had a question or comment back in the slide that had the hourly loads, and I think it's important for context. But is there a daily peak period effect due to the EcoBTOE automation that we're seeing in the loads? Because you see a very distinctive notch between 4 and 9 in the loads. If you go back, not to this one, but the one that was showing the results from the simple diff and diff.
This, yes.
Yeah, but I think that's an important question, because with thermostats, Ecobee started essentially doing daily TUI automation and defaulting customers into that. And I think Nest will be doing that this year, if I remember correctly.
Yes. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And yeah, so Ecobee is actually a growing portion of the population as well. And that is something that we looked at and that we noticed. We actually plotted every single day for the entire summer to just get a sense for what the shapes look like for both participants and for non-participants in this program. And there is a clear sort of shouldering effect that you can see around that time of use window on event days. So yes, there is an underlying time of use intervention that upon which this is actually layered.
Yeah, but all that's enabled by the thermostat. So it's kind of interesting to me, like
That's
the
right.
thermostat effect is being split into two, which one is a daily effect, where those algorithms are being enabled, and the other one's an event day effect. And it becomes a little bit trickier, especially when you start looking at what's the value of the program, because now you have but more than half of it kind of in the dispatchable category, but the other portion of it is basically occurring on a daily basis. So that's just something it probably has some non-trivial implications in terms of how to track this type of thermostat.
Definitely. Thanks. And let's see. So here are these are just screenshots from the table generator, free on the left-hand side, BYOT on the right-hand side. Again, you can see pretty similar shapes, except that there is clearly some pre-cooling occurring in the BYOT population that's not occurring in the free thermostats. They're just controlled a little bit differently. So I'm going to shift over and talk about the enrollment forecast now. So one global model was used to forecast both participants and enrolled thermostats and connected thermostats across the different program elements here. So we've got the two non-residential sort of programs or subprograms, and then the two residential. And key inputs here were, so on the site enrollment forecast piece, we want to understand two things. Think about it as in terms of a stock and flow model, which is actually what we built to do this. So on the one hand, there's what happens to your existing, current participants. And so notice over time, there is basically some attrition. So we've factored in that attrition. Different assumptions based on historicals for on the non-residential side, and on the residential side, a little bit higher attrition, higher retention on the residential side, given that the program is somewhat newer, and there's been a lot of growth in the program recently, so there's a lot sort of newer participation there. There's also the other piece in that site forecasting piece is the projected new enrollments, which are really a function of marketing. The marketing of the program is really focused on that residential BYOT piece. So you'll see that essentially new participants all come in that subcomponent. Then looking at the thermostat side, as I mentioned before, we have noticed that there is some, basically thermostats get disconnected, and we're not talking about short-term disconnections. That happens. A thermostat may lose its Wi-Fi connection temporarily for a week or two even, but then it gets reestablished. What we're talking about here is thermostats that are sort of like long-term disconnects. So we sort of forecast that over time. And as I mentioned, SDG&E does have a process for disenrolling thermostats that just have not been connected in a very long time. So you kind of start with your enrollments in terms of sites, and then you layer on top of that. So what is your sort of retention of your thermostats, or what is the dwindling over time of that? And what is your sort of average number of thermostats per site? One of the things that we've done here that we've seen is in the non-residential side in particular, in the sort of those legacy older thermostats, there were sites that had many sites per, or thermostats per site. And actually participation is now capped at 4 thermostats per site. It has been for a while. So we make sure to incorporate that into our forward-looking forecast. So all of those pieces come together into a stock and flow model. And that from that, we're able to derive annual counts by program for both new thermostats and returning thermostats and sites. And just in terms of some key assumptions for the enrollment forecast model, as I mentioned, I kind of already mentioned the assumption about new enrollments essentially all coming for BYOT, residential BYOT. That is about 6,400 new enrollments that are assumed. That's based on kind of historicals for new enrollments, which is derated somewhat. Plus an additional 1,000 for NEM customers, because the period over which we're looking at new enrollments in that time period, the rules for eligibility for NEM were not as broad. And we have seen, since that has been clarified, that there have been more participation from customers with solar. We do assume that the enrollments flatten out after a few years, which you'll see in the next slide. I have just sort of a chart of that. We're also just sort of ramping up enrollments sort of to mirror the expected smart thermostat uptake in the market. And in terms of how we convert this all to the ex ante sort of monthly forecast, instead of assuming the same number of enrollments for every single month in a year, we actually our forecast for the year sort of the end year forecast, and then we linearly spread going from 1 month to another, from 1 year to the next. So there's a linear spread there. And these are the same assumptions that were used for the DR application last year. So here, so on the non-residential side, you can see, so non-residential customers, we've got AC Saver Day Ahead and Quasi-Res, which, as I mentioned earlier, there's a few hundred on the non-residential. Quasi-Res is just about a dozen. And so here's what I meant when I said that the enrollments are flat over time up to you reach 2029. We just assume that those stay the same. And before that, what we're seeing here is basically disenrollments. It's basically the attrition. And it's a similar story on the right-hand panel, which is, this is connected devices, except it's accelerated a little bit more because in addition to sort of site attrition, you have thermostat failures or disconnections. And that we do assume that that continues even after the enrollments are assumed to stabilize. And the same sort of assumptions apply on the residential side, except that for here, we're assuming that there's substantial enrollment growth of about 6,400 per year, at least for the next 5 years or so. But again, we still do assume that there's some device disconnection that occurs, which we just have seen over time evaluating this program. Now I'll cover the ex ante methodology and results. So as I mentioned earlier, we actually leveraged the 2020 percent impacts for AC Saver Day Ahead for the non-residential, since there have not been events in the past 2 years. For residential, we just use the impacts from this year. We leveraged the enrollment model that I just covered, and of course we use reference loads. And there has been a new specification for ex ante weather this year, and the modeling at which we do that is actually all on a weather station basis, because we use we want to make sure that all the building blocks line up for the sort of the granular executive summary results. So we actually produce here. We're just covering overall system totals, but we actually have forecasts for every single weather station. And in addition, I'm not going to cover it today, but in addition to the sort of standard ex ante forecast, we also produce a time temperature matrix of results, by which instead of providing results for the ex ante weather specification for the different day types, we also provide table where we produce estimated impacts as a function of the max temperature on that day. So whether it's a 75-degree day or a 95-degree day, impacts are very different. And then also as a function of because there's a variable window for this program, a function of the start hour and the duration of the impact. One thing I didn't mention earlier is that we definitely see a bit of a diminishing effects for each subsequent hour. So the duration of the event also affects the expected reductions. And so here we just have summarized actually the percent reductions from 2020. That is what we have at our disposition for applying to the reference loads that we develop with the new the current reference loads we develop with the current participant population. It's just we need a reduction model to apply to that. So here you can see there is definitely a good amount of noise in the estimate. So every single point here is a single event hour, and those that are a square, like a little gray square, that they're not statistically significant. So most of them are positive and significant. They are relatively small because remember, this is non-residential, often large non-residential, which have a lot of other loads other than cooling loads. And so there's a lot of, kind of noise relative to the signal of the actual event reduction. On the residential side, it's a very different picture. So this is for the 2022 events. So first of all, you can see that the reductions are quite a bit larger. And here they're shown as a percent of the cooling load. And here they're actually, it's on the order of 40%, or 30 to 40%. One of the important adjustments that we made for this year, so every blue dot here is an event hour. The two orange dots, those are actually from the September 9th event, which in San Diego, and I think this actually occurred maybe in some of the neighboring territories, but it was a very anomalous weather pattern in which the peak temperature, I think, occurred at like 2 a.m. or something. And then basically, it was sort of the end of that heat wave that you had a sort of cooler weather and rain even that came in. And so weather was actually, the temperature was actually dropping throughout the whole day, and the loads were actually very flat. And it was just very, very anomalous weather pattern and you can see here that the percent reductions are just do not fit the trend at all. And so we chose to exclude those from the ex ante model because essentially, across all of these points, you're looking for a trend, right, of your reduction as a function of the temperature. Well, if you include these points, it actually tips that trend quite a bit. So the orange line is the trend. If you include those, it's actually relatively flat. If you do not include those, it's actually declining a little bit. Now, this, of course, as temperatures get hotter, overall reductions do still increase, but as a percent of cooling load, they decrease a little bit. If we were to include these orange points here, then it would be overestimating what the reductions are. So we excluded that from this estimate. And just an overview in terms of the results, in terms of over time, what we expect and what we are forecasting to occur with these programs. As you saw on the non-residential side, first of all, sort of three things, right? The population is pretty small and it's declining, and the impacts per site are actually quite low as well. So we expect that program this year was estimated at less than half a megawatt, and expected to decline thereafter. On the residential side, it's just the opposite, about 4 megawatts for this year, and increasing thereafter. And these are all August monthly peak day 1 and 2 SDG&E weather conditions. And just a couple more slides here. So I really wanted to think about, so apples to apples comparison, what were the results, thinking about the results forecasted last year. So last year's evaluation for 2022, and this year's estimate for 2022. And that's like the first two lines here. So the program year source year, that just tells you which in which year was the estimate created, but they're all you know, for the year of 2022. So percent reductions increased a little bit on the non-residential side, but the population decreased. And the load reductions decreased also. And then you can see just for reference, the 2020 results also. And on the residential side, same sort of thing. The first two rows, we're looking at the ex ante forecast for 2022, both from last year and from this year. The percent reductions increased a little bit. The load reduction increased a little bit. There's about 3,000 additional, thermostats. And the weather was a little bit hotter. And similar thing that you can see in the ex post results for the events last year and this year, and of course, very different set of events and weather. Cooler, you know, last year it was cooler, etc. And we've actually put that together in terms of sort of a waterfall to think about what are the actual contributors between the last year's estimate for 2022 versus this year's estimate for 2022. So on the left-hand side, you've got the non-residential, and really the key, and sort of broken the pieces out into different contributors. So you've got difference in terms of reference load. So the reference load itself was actually very, very similar. The percent impacts did increase a little bit, probably because there were fewer sort of non-participating thermostats to dilute that. At the same time, enrollment was quite a bit lower. And so that's actually the primary driver of the reductions there. And also a little bit, a slight increase in connectivity for the thermostats that were remaining. But on the residential side, so obviously a much bigger program. Went from 3.4 megawatts to about 4 megawatts this year. And here there was a slight uptick in the reference load effect, primarily due to the hotter temperatures and the ex ante weather specification this year. The percent impacts are actually slightly lower for the same temperature, and that was just looking at that different model. Enrollment increased a little bit as well, and then we've got connectivity that actually improved this year. And that is all I have. Are there any questions?
Yes, I have one question. Why were there no non-residential events called this year? And then what made 2020 different to have any events called that year? I guess it's probably a question
I'd actually
for SDG
defer that
if
one. It's
they're
more
on
a
the
question for
line.
SDG. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Lizette, are you here?
Yeah, I see Lizette raised her hand. If you can unmute her.
Good morning. This is Lizette Garcia from SDG. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The reason that AC0 Day Ahead non-residential program was not triggered is because this program, the resource ID was not bid into the market. So usually we receive a direction from CAISO to bid into the market a program. So that's the reason that this program was not triggered. Mm-hmm.
And back on slide, I think it was 23. Yeah, so I'm curious on the difference, also on the non-residential side, in percent reduction in ex post from 2020, seeing the 1.1% to the ex ante 2022 at 3.4%. where we're seeing that increase. And I know you go over it on slide 24, but can you go a little bit more in depth
Yeah, so
on
there's
what those
it's a
are?
little challenging. Yeah, it's a little challenging here, and you can actually see it on the right hand side too. You can see that the ex post percent reductions are lower. Part of that is it's a little bit of an apples to oranges here because the events are for the 6 to 8 p.m. window. These are average 6 to 8 p.m. events, but the RA window is 4 to 9 p.m., which is 5 hours versus 3 hours. And so kind of what you're seeing here in this being lower is you're getting 2 hours of impacts spread across a larger, along a 5 hour window essentially. And it's it's sort of hard to square the circle. I could have shown it as just those 2 hours, but then like the temperature, like the event temperatures wouldn't have been comparable, which you actually see that those temperatures are actually lower. So I think there's various contributors to that. But probably the biggest one is that it's not exactly an apples to apples comparison here because we've got 2 hours of events that are getting spread over 5 hours. Does that help?
Thank you. Yeah. And
Okay.
Anja from CAISO has asked a question back to Lizette. And the question is, was the non-res program not bid into the market, or did it not receive any awards?
Did not receive any awards.
And with no further questions, I think that is good.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and with that, we are going to take our 10-minute break. Please, everyone, be back at 10:21. All right, 10:21, welcome back everyone. Now we will move on to SDG&E's AC Saver Day of Devices. I think you're still muted.
One sec, sorry guys.
No worries, we can hear you now.
Perfect. You guys see my screen?
Yes.
All right, perfect. So my name is Ridge Peterson. I'll be presenting load impacts for SDG&E's AC Saver Day of program for resource innovations. These impacts were estimated in conjunction with George Jung and Jeremy Smith and myself. So today I'll be giving a brief program overview of the AC Saver Day of program. I'll discuss the ex post methodology and changes to the methodology for the 2022 program year. I'll compare the results for ex post to those yielded from 2019 to 2021. Next, I'll jump into the ex ante side, discuss our enrollment forecast for the next 10 years, discuss the methodology for the ex ante forecasts, and then compare the results that we yielded for this year to those in previous years. And then we'll wrap it up with some conclusions. So AC Saver Day of is a day of demand response program offered both to residential and commercial customers. This utilizes a direct load control central AC using one-way switches installed on customers' AC devices. AC Saver Day of events can be called anytime from April to October. They can range from 2 to 4 hours in length. They can be called anytime from 12 p.m. to 9 p.m. And there's a total maximum of 20 events that can be called on a given event season. And so this table to the right here just showcases enrollment for the end of the 2022 event season. For the residential segment, we saw about 70% of customers being enrolled in the 50% cycling strategy. So their AC units were cycled 50% of the time during events, whereas 30% were enrolled in a 100% cycling strategy where their devices were cycled 100% of the time during events that were called. On the commercial side of things, we saw about 25% of customers being enrolled in the 30% cycling strategy and 75% of customers being enrolled in the 50% cycling strategy. So in program year 2022, we saw 11 AC Saver Day of events called for a total of 29 direct load control hours total. 5 of these events were called during the typical hours of 6 to 8 p.m., with 3 of those events occurring on weekdays. We also saw 3 weekend/holiday events, all of which occurred on the 3-day weekend during Labor Day from Saturday to Monday, from September 3rd to September 5th. 17 temperatures during the 11 events ranged from 74 degrees to 87 degrees Fahrenheit, and maximum event window temperatures ranged from 74 degrees to 93 degrees. So I want to briefly overview the methodology for the ex post analysis. So in previous years, what we had done for the residential segment is implement a randomized control trial where customers had been randomly assigned to a series of groups, and a certain group was held back were not cycled during given events. This year, we chose to have all customers enrolled in the program cycled during every event. And for that reason, we needed to implement a match control group for the residential segment, which is what we had previously implemented for the commercial segment as well. So our matches this year were found using 3 main criteria. The first being peak energy demand during 2022 proxy days. Our proxy days this year were defined as the days during the summer event season most similar to actual event days in terms of weather, with the distinction being an event was not called on them. So we used peak demand on those 2022 proxy days as one of the main criteria to identify control customers. We also use demand during event days, before and immediately after the event hours. And then lastly, we matched in the case of commercial on industry, as well as on climate zone and net metering status. So retail firms, for instance, were only matched with other retail firms. Customers in the coastal climate zone were only matched with other customers in the coastal climate zone, and net meter customers were only matched with other net meter customers. And so these 2 graphs highlight the results of our match control group for both the residential and commercial segment. As you can see, the light blue line represents the match control group load profile, whereas the dark blue line represents the treatment group's load profile. You can see visually that both these groups yielded very similar matches in terms of proxy day energy use behavior, which indicates that they are a good comparison group and a good counterfactual for energy use on actual event days. So the next step of our ex post methodology was to implement a regression framework to estimate impacts for the residential and commercial segments. So in previous years, when we had implemented the RCT approach, we had utilized a lag-dependent variable framework. However, because this year we chose to move to match control, we motivated that to implement a difference in difference methodology to control for any remaining inherent behavioral differences between our treatment and our match control customers, as well as any inherent differences between the pre-period or the pre-treatment period on proxy days and the actual event days. And so this formula just gives a brief overview of the difference in difference regression. Our main treatment variable of interest is the interaction between treatment status and the post variable, which is a binary that indicates whether it was an actual event day or proxy day. So with that in mind, first I want to present results for the residential segment. So we found that in the residential segment, we saw strong and statistically significant impacts for all 11 event days. Per site impacts ranged from 0.05 kilowatts to 0.3 kilowatts. And we found that impacts generally increased as the temperature increased. During the average 6 to 8 p.m. weekday event, we saw impacts of about 0.2 kilowatts and an aggregate about 1.68 megawatts. On the commercial segment, we saw a little bit more variation in the magnitude and statistical significance of impacts. Per site, impacts ranged from 0.36 kilowatts to not statistically different from 0. And we found that only 4 event days had statistically significant impacts, with the average 6 to 8 p.m. event yielding a per site impact of about 0.1 kilowatts and an aggregate impact of about 0.23 kilowatts. And so with those impacts in mind, I want to compare the events for the 2022 program year to those in 2021 and 2020. The first thing I want to point out is that this year we saw virtually all 8 out of 11 of our event days were called during days with mean 17s in excess of 75 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you can see this graph shows mean 17 temperature for the entire event season from April to October for the past 3 years. You can see that in 2022, virtually all of our events were called during the hottest period of the summer from mid-August to late September. I also want to point out that during this period, virtually every day was an event day. So nearly all of our representative high temperature late summer days had an actual event called. And so that came into play when we were selecting proxy days for these events, because essentially all the hot days during the summer were actual events. That meant that our proxy days were a little bit cooler than the actual events that were called. In contrast this with 2020 and 2021, where we observed in 2020, while there were some hot weather events, we also saw a lot of cool weather events earlier in the summer. And we also observed a lot of hot weather proxy days where the weather was above 75 degrees in mean 17, but an event was not called. 2021, we actually saw cool weather all around during the summer, and very few days during peak summer period that exceeded 75 degrees in mean 17. So we wanted to give you these graphs as context for the weather sensitivity that we observed this year and how that might have impacted our proxy day selection as we jump into the comparison of this year's events to impacts from recent years. So this graph shows the relationship between mean 17 and per premise impacts for the last 4 years from 2019 to 2022, with 2022's impacts being highlighted in red. So the first thing I want to point out here is that the average mean 17 and per premise impacts in 2022 were larger than the last 3 years in absolute magnitude. And then the other point I'd like to draw your attention to is weather sensitivity. So these straight lines are the line of best fit between mean 17 and average event impact for each individual year. You can see that each year the relationship in the residential segment was clearly positive. And while the slope of this line was a little bit less steep this year in 2022 than it was in previous years, this difference was not statistically significant. So we didn't see a marked difference in weather sensitivity in 2022 relative to previous years in the residential segment. Next, I want to showcase the average event impacts for the average 6 to 8 p.m. weekday event for this year relative to the last 3 years. So you can see that the average per premise impacts were significantly larger this year owing to the higher temperatures, with an average of 0.2 kilowatts compared to 0.11, 0.13, and 0.06 kilowatts respectively for 2019, 2021, and 2020 and 2021. Also, we observed that the aggregate impacts were larger this year relative to previous years. And this was due to 2 factors. The first being larger per premise impacts driven by increased weather and higher temperatures, but also keep in mind that this year we did not implement the randomized control approach where certain customers were held back. And so not only were we observing higher per premise impacts, but we were also having more customers cycled per event because we didn't include a held back group for each event. So that those 2 factors led to larger aggregate impacts in 2022 relative to previous years. And looking at the same thing for the commercial side, once again, this year we observed that commercial impacts were inconsistent in magnitude and statistical significance. with the largest and most significant impacts occurring during the events on August 16th, September 4th, and September 5th. We also observed that in the commercial segment, there was not a meaningful relationship between increased temperature and higher load impacts. So we didn't see as much weather sensitivity on the commercial side of things. And one thing I want to point out here is that while this slope was negative, while the relationship between mean 17 and per premise impacts was negative for 2022, we don't believe that this actually indicates negative weather sensitivity for this year. We think this was just due to the statistical imprecision of the impacts and the fact that a lot of our high temperature days actually occurred during Labor Day weekend. So we had the effective temperature confounded with the fact that those high temperature days occurred during holiday and weekday events. So we couldn't necessarily separate the impact of temperature from the impact of those events occurring on a holiday weekend. So we don't believe that weather sensitivity in the commercial segment is actually negative. We believe that's just due to confounding variables and uncertainty in the data. And to expand on that point, we found that the average 6 to 8 p.m. weekday events were very similar in magnitude for 2022 to 2021 and 2019. We found per premise impacts of about 0.1 kilowatt this year relative to 0.09 in 2021 and 2019. And for 2020, we found impacts that were significantly smaller owing due to the impact of COVID, but relative to the other 2 years that we compared to, 2022 was actually very similar in average terms to those last 2 years. So with the ex post results in mind, I want to jump over to the ex ante side of things and forecasting for the next 10 years of the AC Saver program. So starting with enrollments for the next 10 years, we produced a new enrollment forecast with SDG&E that goes through 2033 this year. And we expect both residential and commercial enrollments to decline as the program is no longer being actively marketed. We expect that by 2027, the customers who would attrit from the program have already, so we forecasted enrollment to be stable from 2027 to 2033, but we expect a decline in enrollment from 2023 until 2027. So the next piece of estimating ex ante impacts was to utilize a model relating impacts on the average 6 to 8 p.m. event day to mean 17 during the given event day, and then applying a shaping rate ratio to extend the impacts during those average 2-hour events to the 5-hour RA window. This year, we utilized ex post impacts from 2019, 2021, and 2022 in producing the ex ante model. Once again, like last year's evaluation, we chose to omit 2020 from the ex ante model due to the effect of COVID-19. Here you can see the line of best fit during those 3 years between mean 17 and average per ton event impact. You can see that in the residential segment, the slope of this line was positive for all 3 years. As observed in 2022, we don't necessarily believe that this means that they were completely insensitive to weather.
Sorry, we lost you for a moment there. If you could go back about 20 seconds.
Yeah. Was I on this slide when I cut out?
Yeah, you were on this slide.
Okay. I'll just recap from the start. So our ex ante methodology, once we had put together enrollment forecasts for the next 10 years, was to utilize a regression framework using mean 17 as a primary explanatory variable. We then applied shaping ratios to extrapolate the average 6 to 8 p.m. 2-hour weekday events to the 5-hour resource adequacy window. And we utilized ex post impacts from 2019, 2021, and 2022 to build the ex ante model for this year. And like last year's evaluation, because of COVID-19, we chose to omit 2020 from the ex ante methodology. So these graphs, once again, just showcase the relationship between mean 17 and per ton event impacts over the last 3 years. Once again, I want to point out that for the commercial segment, while this slope is negative, we don't believe that this actually is due to negative weather sensitivity in this segment. We think this is just due to statistical noise resulting from the 2022 impacts, as well as the fact that commercial customers, by and large, are not very sensitive to changes in weather, but we don't think this means that they're actually reducing impacts as a result of higher temperatures. And so with that model and using the forecasts for the next 10 years, we produced ex ante aggregate megawatt impacts for 2 scenarios, a 1 in 2 weather year and a 1 in 10 weather year. Produced ex ante impacts for a typical August event day, as well as monthly peaks for all months from April to October. We found that on average, ex ante predictions for residential customers were more weather sensitive than commercial, which was consistent with behavior observed in this year's ex post analysis, with the residential average megawatt impacts for a 1 in 2 weather year being about 1.2 megawatts and 1.6 megawatts for a 1 in 10 weather year. Whereas on the commercial side of things, we saw impacts of about 0.2 megawatts for all weather scenarios. And our next step was to compare these ex ante results to those yielded from the 2021 evaluation. So a couple things changed for this year's ex ante forecasts compared to last year. Number one being that we produced new enrollment forecasts, but we also produced new ex ante weather forecasts to be used. But despite these changes, we found that the overall ex ante megawatt forecasts were actually very similar to those that we produced last year, with the residential typical event day in a 1 in 2 weather year yielding 1.1 megawatts in load reduction according to the 2021 forecast, and yielding 1.2 megawatts in load reduction according to this year's forecast. In the commercial segment, we saw that the typical event day in a 1 in 2 weather year yielded a 0.3 megawatt reduction according to the 21 forecast and a 0.2 megawatt reduction according to the 2022 forecast. And so although the weather forecasts were updated this year, as well as the enrollment forecasts, we did see that the overall ex ante model yielded very similar results for ex ante weather predictions for this year relative to last year. And the next comparison we made was looking at this year's ex post results and last year's ex ante predictions. So in essence, comparing the actual impacts for 2022's events to the predicted impacts using last year's ex ante model. And what we found was using the SDG&E typical August 1 and 2 event day prediction from last year, we found per premise impacts of 0.16 kilowatts in the residential segment and 0.13 kilowatts in the commercial segment. And this year, for the ex post impacts, we observed per premise impacts of about 0.2 kilowatts in the residential segment and 0.1 kilowatts in the commercial segment. So while this comparison isn't perfect owing to the shaping ratios applied during the ex ante process, that leads to this not being an apples to apples comparison. That being said, though, we do see fairly similar actual impacts observed this year during the average event as predicted using the ex ante model last year. So to wrap everything up, on the ex post side of things, we made a couple changes to the evaluation. Since last year, we eliminated the randomized control trial approach in favor of a match control approach, which had the advantage of allowing all residential customers to be cycled during event days. This also motivated a change from a lag-dependent variable regression to a difference in difference regression framework. We found that residential impacts in 2022 were larger compared to previous years due to higher event temperatures observed, whereas on the commercial side of things, we observed that ex post impacts were consistent on average with previous years due to less weather sensitivity in that segment. On the ex ante side of things, we produced new ex ante weather forecasts this year through 2033, as well as new ex ante enrollment forecasts. However, despite these changes, we found that the ex ante forecasts this year were very similar to those produced in previous years. And for that reason, we expect that changes in future ex ante predictions will largely be driven by changes in enrollment forecasts. With that, I'd like to open the floor to questions.
I'm not currently seeing any new questions in the chat. I did have a question though about using mean 17 temperatures. I think between slides 8 and 9, you kind of showed when the actual events were occurring, and almost all of them are happening much later in the event window. And we're still comparing across using mean 17 temperature data, which would be before all of those events. So I guess I'm kind of wondering why mean 17 was used as opposed to mean 19, for example, which would be in the middle of most of these events.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because this year we had actually looked at a couple different ex ante models to see if there was a better predictor we could use in lieu of mean 17. We looked at max event window temperature as our key explanatory variable. We looked at a combination of those variables. We looked at customer specific or month specific fixed effects. But what we found is using out of sample testing, those models were not significantly better at predicting impacts for the 2022 year as the model of just mean 17 included was. And so even as we included other variables that we felt would probably be more effective at predicting impacts, we actually found that those models were not any better at actually predicting impacts as observed in 2022. So we chose to stay with mean 17 for the reason being that that was our primary variable used in previous years, and it yielded similar and in many cases better predictions for 2022 than other explanatory variables did.
Great, that makes sense to me. Not seeing any other questions, I believe we can move on to the last presentation of the day. And that would be SCE's summer discount plan.
Yes, so I'll be presenting the SCE summer discount plan. Let me just get it pulled up. Here we go. So the summer discount plan program, there's a couple distinctive characteristics about this program. So essentially, it operates through a temporary curtailment of a participant's central AC. And so it's going directly to the source. I know tomorrow we'll be speaking on SCE's thermostat program, which obviously is connected to the AC. But essentially what this is participants have a load cycling switch installed on at least one of their units, either at their home or their business. And on those high energy use or high energy price days, there is some level of load reduction or curtailment. So customers can select to curtail their load. In the residential sector, they can select either 100%, where that's essentially their air conditioner is out of use for the entirety of the event duration. 50%, which essentially switches in 15-minute intervals. So it'll be on for 15, off for 15, on for 15, off for 15 in a given hour. And then additionally, the commercial customers are eligible to select a 30% curtailment. And so again, this is only for those commercial customers. Southern California Edison can dispatch the summer discount plan in any month of the year, but the total program dispatch is limited to 180 event hours annually. And on any given day, the program can be dispatched for up to 6 hours. I know that in emergency conditions, that 6 hours can also extend beyond, but typically that is the maximum limit for any given event day. And so this is the idea of the program. And so for this evaluation, basically the objectives are in two parts. The first being to estimate the demand reductions that were delivered via the 2022 operations. And I'm sure, as we all know, that is extremely important since there was some big heat waves this year. And then the secondary evaluation objective is to quantify the magnitude of the reductions available in the future so that they can be used for planning. So this AC cycling program, the events are dispatched by geographically defined regional subgroups. So this is broken down into a couple different components. So the chart you're looking at, it has each of the load control groups. So this is broken out into the 4 central groups: high desert, low desert, north, northwest, and then the 2 west groups. Additionally, we've broken it out by the different cycling strategies. As you can see, under 30% cycling, residential has none, since that is a commercial only objective. And then additionally, you can see whether or not it's residential or commercial. So this is looking at the count of customers in each of these different bins. So obviously it varies, but I think a couple just high level takeaways from this chart is that the residential side obviously accounts for a lot more customers, which makes sense. And then you can also see that the majority of both the residential and the commercial customers elect to be in the 100% cycling group. So yeah, you can see here this first bullet point kind of says that 80% of participants and tonnage and the devices are in the 100% cycling group. So we find that most of the customers do elect this option. Additionally, 50% of the resources are in the central sublap. So these 4 C's right here, these comprise the central region. And so we kind of see them here. We do have a good bit of customers that have solar as well. And so this is something we've kind of been looking at as we move forward. Additionally, some of the residential customers, actually about a quarter of the residential customers, are on a low income rate. And then I think a big thing to keep in mind for our commercial customers is over 80% of the air conditioning tonnage comes from schools and religious organizations. And so obviously these two groups, they take up a big portion, but they also have variable loads. So, right, our schools aren't operating at full capacity through the primary summer months. So, July and August. And so the capacity of the commercial program is decreased a bit during that time. I did see this question come in about control groups, and I'll hit on that when we get to the methodology, and then we can kind of focus on that a little bit. So this is what the system loads looked like in comparison to prior years. And so I was actually on this evaluation in 2021 as well. And obviously there was a huge difference between those 2 years. In 2021, it was fairly mild temperatures. The peak loads were nowhere near where they were this year. So obviously the conditions of this year lended more to the need for these programs in the state of California. And so you can see here that these peak days, the events were dispatched. And this gives a high level look at what the events for the summer discount program look like this year. There was those back-to-back events in the beginning of September. So you can see the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. There were events called in the Edison territory. Additionally, that September 5th date was Labor Day, which is a little bit different than what we've seen in the past. Weekend or holiday events are not something that we typically see. And so I think that was something that we really had to kind of keep in mind moving forward with the evaluation this year, and understanding that Labor Day, specifically for our commercial customers, was going to be a little bit different than what we had seen before. And then also, I think we just kind of want to point out that this year, because of this heat wave and because of the set of customers that we're looking at, there were some overlapping interventions that affected the customers that we pull for our control pool. So obviously, the flex alerts, the emergency loads program, and then that emergency notification on the 6th of September, I think is a big one, and it's an important one to kind of think about, because this perturbed the entire group of everyone, essentially, right? And so it's important to recognize that the incremental load reduction on this September 6th day might not appear as big as other days. And that's because that even if the SDP program hadn't been dispatched, these customers would have still received a notification to reduce their loads on this given day. Okay, so we can look at here. This kind of gets into how we kind of run the demand reductions for 2022 operations. So the first thing we start to look at is proxy days. So for each event day, we select 3 days in that given year that kind of reflect load shapes had an event been dispatched on these proxy days. So essentially, there are days where nothing was dispatched, SDP wasn't dispatched, but the loads look similar to how the loads looked on our event days. So you can see an example here. The idea is just getting at the fact that they mirror the shapes on the event days up until the event hours, right? Because on those event hours, we'll see the notch where the load reduction is taking place. But they provide a good counterfactual for what we would expect to see had an event not been dispatched. I think I'd also like to point out too here, on that Labor Day event, you can kind of see that we weren't able to select a proxy day that we weren't able to select 3 proxy days that fully followed that load. The shape followed, but the magnitude was a little different. And that again is because this Labor Day event, it occurred on an unusual day because it was a holiday. And so I think that plays a factor. But you can also see that we did find the first 2 proxy days were extremely similar to the loads we saw on that day. So then this is where we'll touch on the match controls. I know I saw a question about that in the chat. A single control customer was chosen for each participant based on that individual's loads during those proxy days. So we do some hard matching here. So that's essentially saying that within these characteristics, we will be selecting customers that match. So for residential, whether or not they are NEM customers, so whether they have solar, obviously that's going to play an important piece because loads are extremely different for customers who have solar and who don't have solar. Within the climate group, so I think that touches on that kind of the regional group. So yeah, we do match for residential within those regional groups because we know that it affects how customers consume energy on any given day. And then additionally, the size of the customer. So this is kind of just helping make sure that we kind of match customers to those who have a similar amount of consumption in a given year. On the commercial side, it's done a little bit differently. And most of that is because commercial customers tend to not be as weather sensitive. So we're not having to worry as much about the climate group and things like that. And so for our commercial customers, we match on industry and size because we found that industry tends to give the best descriptor on how loads will be used across a given day. So again, schools have a very fundamental load shape, and that load shape tends to be very different than maybe a manufacturing facility. And so matching with industry kind of helps with that. We match our customers with propensity score matching with replacement. We use with replacement because this kind of helps to find the best match, right? So we don't mind if we're matching a control customer more than once. We just want to find the best match. And then all of this kind of leads up to obviously the regression analysis that we use to actually estimate the demand reductions on these event days. So we do use a difference in difference panel regression with those match controls. You can kind of see that on each event day, we use the corresponding proxy event days to net out differences between the treatment and the control groups that weren't due to the actual calling of the SDP program. And in this methodology, we do estimate the hourly impacts by subcategories. So that's like looking at those regional subgroups, looking at whether or not a customer has solar or not. But we first start by estimating those impacts across the entire customer group, since obviously that is the full reduction and is what is really important to make sure that we're reducing over time. And so this touches a little bit on how we go from those 2022 operational impacts, those ex post impacts, to those planning forecasts about what could happen with the ex ante impacts. So this ex post little block talks about a lot of what we just talked about. What were the reductions? Obviously, they vary on things based like temperature, the hours that they were dispatched, the participant mix that was dispatched, because you can dispatch different regional groups. So we take all of that ex post data that we actually measured the reductions for, and there's some adjustments we make to the data to make sure that we're looking at everything kind of on a standardized plane. So we look at a standardized set of weather, the 1 in 2 weather and the 1 in 10 weather. We assume full dispatch of resources are available on any given planned day. We standardize the hours and the length of the dispatch. So that's looking at, I think as of recently, we've been using this resource adequacy window. And so that's the time frame that we're looking at. And we typically, like I said, go up to 6 hours, 5 or 6 hours, because that is the maximum length of an event. Obviously, as we go forward, we have to incorporate more information on any changes that are going forward. And then I think most importantly, obviously, for the STP program is this adjustment for project enrollment. And so you'll kind of see when we get to the ex ante impacts how that makes such a difference for this STP program. So with these adjustments, we're able to produce the ex ante impacts that kind of plan for what's going to potentially happen in the future. And so we start to get what's the magnitude of program resources available under the defined set of planning conditions. We look at the Edison and the CAISO weather conditions. And like I said, this 1 in 2 versus the 1 in 10 weather conditions. And we look at this by month too. So we look at primarily the summer months. And that is mostly because, that's when this program is primarily called. So a lot of that was just kind of the setup. Like I discussed at the beginning, the summer discount program is broken down into residential and commercial. And so we'll look at the sets of results independently between the two, which is kind of why we do all the setup in the beginning, so you can kind of understand what we're looking at. And we're going to start with residential because it is such a large program. This is where we typically start. Things start to deviate a little bit more with commercial. So obviously this is a busy chart, but it has the extent of the results we kind of found throughout this process for our residential customers. So one thing to note when you're looking at this table, we only include full hours for the impact estimates in this table. So if you look at the Labor Day event, obviously there's some partial hours in there. And since we're looking at hourly interval data, we estimate for this specific table just based on the full event hours. We do the full estimation and you can see what the partial hours saved. It's obviously diluted because the program was only dispatched for a subset of those hours. So we have the 6 different dates where the program was dispatched. And so you can see here which load control groups were dispatched for each date. So I think the big one, the one that kind of is how things can be situated, is the September 8th event, where you can see there was 3 different dispatch windows and they each called a different group of resources. So this is kind of helpful because, first of all, it gives us a good insight into how these regional subgroups kind of may be able to reduce load differently on different weather days. But it's also just important because you don't want to fatigue your customers, especially at the end of a heat wave like this, right? Calling them in different groups, make sure that you're not just putting a lot of pressure on your full group of customers for a full, 3 to 4 hour span. You can also look here, there's different event starts, event ends, which obviously impact the load reductions on any given day. I think more importantly, it's how hot it is at that time, right? Because we are looking at a full AC switch. So if it's really hot at 9 p.m., people are still probably going to be using a good bit of AC, much like they would typically at 5 or 6 p.m. And then I think the third thing I'll kind of point out before we look at this average event and how much we kind of see in a load reduction is this September 6th event. So you may see here, it's highlighted in blue, and that essentially just indicates that it was the system peak day. And then it's broken down into 2 different groups. So, there was one section where the entire, all of the load control groups were dispatched. It all started at 5 p.m. And then there was a bit of a hiccup with an early restoration for a subset of customers. Edison actually identified this early restoration pretty quickly and reached out. And at that time, those resources that had been restored were no longer needed. So the customers were not dispatched again. And so that's why you can see there's a slight difference in event start an event end between those two different groups. So this bottom row here looks at if we kind of just look at the amalgamation of all the events that were dispatched in the 2022 season, what does that look like? And so we call this average event, we construct it based on the first event hour. And because there's not the uptick after the first event hour for an AC cycling program, since it's just a switch on the device. This first event hour gives us a really good look because all of our events at least had one full event hour. So you can see here that we have the reference load, and then we have the load with the demand response event dispatched. And that generates about 140 megawatt reduction across that first event hour that we tended to see with the events dispatched this season. We also break it down by the impact per account, per device, and per ton. The per account and per device numbers are pretty similar for the SDP program, for the SDP residential program, because most residential customers don't have, 5 AC units. We're looking at, a 1-to-1 in most cases. And so that's why those are pretty similar. And then you can see it's actually, it's over a quarter of a reduction in percent impact. So we're seeing about a 28% impact for the 2022 demand response season. And then you can see kind of what the temperature was like. There were some really hot days, I'm sure, as a lot of you experienced. But then there was also these two that were in June and August that tended to be slightly cooler and weren't necessarily for emergency reasons. So this kind of gives us a more direct look into a single day. And so this is kind of what we look at to understand what that notch looks like during the event hours. So you can see here that for the residential program, they reduced their demand by 170 megawatts during the first full event hour on the peak day. So that includes this group that was dispatched for the full time, and then it additionally includes this group that underwent early restoration. That first hour was really important, and it delivered a big punch. And so as you can kind of see here, on this 9/6 event day, it's a drastic drop in load, which makes sense why it would be a 28% reduction in load. It's very clear that these customers are reducing their load. What's also clear, and what we kind of hit on earlier, is that you can see in this load shape right here that our control has a bit of a notch where we wouldn't typically imagine it would have a notch. And that harkens back to the fact that there was that emergency alert to customers. And so some of our control customers did receive notification to reduce load that they wouldn't have on the other events or in previous years. It definitely did not drastically affect the load reduction, as you can kind of tell. It's really a slight notch, but it is important because it is there. So the next thing we kind of looked at is we said, okay, we understand how each event performed, we understand how the average event performed, but how do we look at this and how do we kind of contextualize this a bit more? And so we started to look at the relationship between the reductions and the weather. So obviously, it makes sense, right? As it gets hotter, we're going to see bigger reductions because people are going to be running their AC more. And so we have the ability to kind of just completely cut that off for the 100% cycling group or reduce how much the AC is being used. And so in this case, each bubble indicates an event hour in a given load control group. And then the size of the bubble kind of helps to indicate the number of accounts that were dispatched. And again, when we look at stuff like this, we just include those full event hours because the partial ones do have a bit of a diluted impact because it wasn't a full event hour. But as you see here, it's a pretty clear relationship. As it gets hotter, the SDP program will obviously be able to deliver more demand reductions. So this starts to look at it by the cycling strategy. So I've been talking about the 100% and the 50% cycling group. And so you can see it broken down. We have that same impact per participant and the temperature trend going on here, but broken down between 50 and 100% cycling. And so as you can see here, obviously the 50% cycling on a straight impact per participant level is going to reduce demand less because those participants are not cutting their AC nearly as much. I do think it's important to mention, and you can see this call out here, that 50% AC cycling does not mean that you're getting half of the impacts that you are at 100% cycling, right? Because for a 15-minute cycling, you'd be getting exactly half if that customer was running their AC for the full hour. But that's not always the case. You know, sometimes their AC would only be running anyways for 30 minutes of the full hour. And so when this event's dispatched, you know, you might not be getting a full half of the reduction that you are from your 100% cycling group. You might be getting a little bit less. And customers do self-select into which cycling strategy they would want. And the 50% cycling group, I'm sure the way it kind of keeps coming up is that, you know, they're not reducing as much, but they still do reduce significantly. And I think in the 50% cycling group, obviously you're helping temper like customer relations, because this person is not experiencing zero AC for multiple hours at a time. And so this self-selection kind of helps them decide how much they would like to be disturbed on these emergency events. So that's kind of a high-level look at all of our ex post analysis for the residential side of things. So now we've kind of shifted into the more planning future conditions ex ante side of things. So this is a big matrix of graphs, and essentially it's broken down by the things we've kind of talked about very, very broadly, the different cycling groups, and then the different load control groups. And essentially, when we model ex ante, we model each of these groups independently. And so we understand that those at a 50% cycling in the low desert have a different pattern than those that are at 100% cycling in the Northwest, right? Things differ between each of these sectors, and so it's important that we model them independently. The modeled reductions are formed as a function of temperature and hour of the day. We find that those two factors really make a big difference in the demand reductions we see. Again, this population varies by control group, or load control group, which is why that is such an important piece to distinguish by. And then additionally, those load control groups have different event history. So if you think back to that first chart we looked at, on that September 8th event, different load control groups were dispatched at different times. And so we do see a little bit of variability in when customers in these groups were dispatched. And so this helps us, again, to kind of make sure that we're using the data for those load reductions for that correct grouping of customers. We also do see at the low end, so when you kind of get down to the lower temperatures on the left-hand side of each of these graphs, in most cases, the impacts tend to kind of flatten out and get near zero, because if you're at 60 degrees, people aren't going to be running their AC nearly as much. You can also see here that there is 4 different years that are plotted on this graph. So we have 2019 through 2022, and we use the event reductions from these 4 years to inform for those planning conditions in the future. So this kind of gives a look. That was the high level of how we went about modeling them. This is where we can kind of see what that modeling looked like for the customers in the SDP residential program. So on this left-hand side of things, you can see what this looks like for forecast year 2023 for a 1 and 2 August peak day in the SCE weather. And so this blue line gives you the load with DR. So again, you can see this notch in that resource adequacy window. And then we've additionally included the confidence bands because obviously these are predictions and they have a little bit of wiggle room around them because we're not sure exactly how everything will function. So you can see here that during the event window, the planning conditions show about a 157 megawatt reduction in that August monthly peak day in the 1 and 2 weather. And so we have the full table generator where you can change the month that you're looking at, change the weather year, the weather data, all of these things. And obviously, as you do that, the load reduction changes. But the basis of it, the core of it stays the same of what we're looking at. Then on the right-hand side, you can kind of see what an August peak day looks like under both weather types, so Edison weather and CAISO weather. And then additionally, you can see it go down by forecast year. And so this is kind of what I alluded to earlier. In the current state, the SDP enrollment forecast is projected to decline in the future. And so what you kind of see here is that your megawatt reductions on a given day will continue to decline as your enrollment forecast declines because they do go hand in hand as more customers are removed or drop out of the program. You can't get the reduction anymore. And so that's what you kind of see here is that it slowly starts to decline as our enrollment forecasts decline. And so we kind of say after we've seen these ex ante impacts, let's look at how our ex ante impacts this year compared to the ex ante impacts that we've produced in the past. So you can kind of see this in two forms on this slide. The graph shows you the blue dots are the estimated impacts from 2020, gray is 2021, and then orange is 2022. And so you can see the per customer impacts all tend to follow the same trend. I think it's important to mention that these results will obviously differ between these 3 years because we're using a different set of reference loads to model what the load shape looks like. And we're also using a different set of event days. So we've expanded to include more events so we have more data to inform what these planning conditions will look like. Additionally, it's good to point out that in 2022, the ex ante weather that we were working off was updated. I believe in some of the months, we actually saw that the weather or the temperatures increased for the average August event day. And in some months it actually decreased. So it kind of depends on that. But you can see here that this year, our estimates are slightly larger than they have been in the past 2 years. I think a big part of that, right, is we saw some emergency dispatches this year where things were extremely hot, and the program was a necessary component. And so we're including these event hours where the program was fundamental to continue to operate the grid. And then additionally, like we saw in 2021, it was much cooler. So the data that we added in 2021 just kind of reflected these not so emergency conditions. And so the addition of these has kind of brought up the planning impacts for the future years. Obviously, the more data we get, the better informed these ex ante models are because there's so much variation year to year. Again, like I said, I worked on this program last year as well. And doing the analysis across the 2 years has been fundamentally different in the fact that it was 2 different total conditions that we were looking at. So that kind of wraps up the residential side of things. I will let you know that as we go through the commercial side, you'll essentially see the same thing. So I probably won't walk you in as much detail through what the tables and the graphs mean, because they're replicated from our residential side, but we can focus more on those results. So again, here we have the impacts for our commercial customers. So again, we're looking at a much smaller portion of customers. It's about 7,000 for our average event, where our average event for residential was over 150,000. But obviously these customers are substantially bigger. And so you can see here on that average event day, the commercial program delivers about a 15 megawatt reduction across that first event hour. And then if you kind of slide over to the impact per account, device, and ton, I think it's interesting here. I think this is where I really recognize the difference between our commercial customers and our residential customers, because you can see that per account, the commercial side delivers significantly more in kilowatts. So the residential side is, 0.8 kilowatts, and then commercial is 2.14 for a given account. Again, they're going to have many more AC units, so the per device goes down a little bit. The same for the ton. So we see that the commercial customers reduce their impact by about 10%. And again, there's a little bit more variation with our commercial customers because of how much schools and religious organizations make up this grouping. There's sometimes when schools just aren't in session, and so they're not going to be able to deliver much of a load reduction at all. And so things kind of fluctuate a bit more. And then additionally, customers can select 30% cycling in this group. So we're seeing, a step below 50%. And those customers obviously show less of a load reduction than those at 50% do. So this looks at that September 6th event across these two groups that we kind of talked about. And we can see that for the full event hour on this peak day, the commercial summer discount plan reduced demand by 26 megawatts. Again, we see the clear divot in the hours, and then you see again the impacts in the hours that are after the first full hour. Since the only overlapping time frame was this first full hour, that's how we report out what happened on this peak day, because there was two different groups. So here we're looking at the reductions the relationship between the reductions and the weather. So on the commercial side, we still do see the trend where there's more reduction the hotter it gets, which makes sense, but it's a less strong relationship than residential is, since a lot of the residential load focuses on AC, and that's not the case with our commercial customers, especially those in manufacturing. When the machines are running is going to be when the load is high, and that doesn't always correspond to the temperature. So you can kind of see that pattern here. It's a little bit less strong, but it is fundamentally still there, which is obviously useful because on hotter days, we're hoping for a larger demand reduction in these customers. So this is looking at the impacts for the cycling strategy. So as you can see here, we've only reported on 100% cycling and 50% cycling. And that's essentially because that group of 30 is a fairly small group. So the results are kind of all over the place. They cause a bit more confusion than they provide resource in this. So here we just look at the trends between 100% cycling and 50% cycling. And as you can see here again, 50% is going to deliver less. If we had more in our 30% cycling group, we would see them be below even the 50% cycling. And again, it's not a 50% cycling delivers half of what 100% does. It's more nuanced than that because of how long your air conditioner is running in a given hour. So kind of looking at the commercial side of things and understanding how this may change in the planning conditions. There's a bit more nuance when we move into the ex ante side of commercial, mostly because of COVID and how that has kind of impacted some of the prior year's data that we would use. So obviously, 2020 for the commercial sector was a bit of a weird year. And so that kind of changed how commercial customers responded to the SDP program. And so we've actually removed 2020 and additionally 2021 because of the effects of COVID. We're still able to look at 3 years of data. We just remove those years that might not reflect what the future will look like going forward. And that's the biggest thing with ex ante is not only do you want to look at as much data as you can, right, because that'll better inform your model, but if you look at years where there was something fundamentally different, that won't inform what you see going forward. And so we've just removed them for the ex ante modeling for the commercial side of things. So you can see here the trends across 2018, 2019, and 2022 for the 3 cycling groups. I will point out that for commercial this year, this modeling was done again by load control group and cycling strategy. Although you do only see the cycling strategy on the graph on the left-hand side, that's mostly just because when you add load control group, it gets too small and nobody can really see what you're looking at. And so this just gives us a general idea of the trends for the cycling strategies, but it is modeled by load control group as well. This last bullet point kind of hits on what I just mentioned on the previous slide. The population varies by the cycling strategy. And so there's about 8% of the devices are in the 30% cycling group, which is why you kind of see this more dispersed trend. Once you get to 100% cycling, that's where about 64% of the devices are held. And so there's a much stronger relationship there. And that's just something we've seen in many of the historical years, is that this trend gets looser as you go down to lower cycling levels. So this is what our ex ante impacts look like for that 2023 August monthly peak day in the 1 and 2 Edison weather. And so as you can kind of see here, it's not nearly as defined as a drop as we see in our residential customers, which makes sense given how commercial loads function. But it is still very clear. We're predicting that for the August monthly peak day, we'll see a 16 megawatt reduction, which is still significant. And again, by the time you hit 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, your schools are out, you're not going to get nearly as much because they account for 80% of the AC tonnage. On the right-hand side, again, you can kind of see how the megawatts change moving forward. The commercial side of the SDP program is also forecasted to kind of drop in the upcoming years. But I think in both cases, it's important to remember that you're still getting a significant megawatt reduction from this program because it does go directly to the source of the AC unit. And so this is comparing what we have found this year in ex ante to the previous years of ex ante. Again, we're using different data each year. We're also looking at the vintage year that was in the midst of COVID. And so I think that plays an impact too. But you can see here again, you know, the trends remain the same. At a given weather temperature for a commercial side of things, it varies slightly between the 3 years that we're looking at here, but commercial tends to stay a bit more steady than we saw the residential side when comparing them. And part of that is just, you know, commercial customers, you know, if you're keeping the same customers in your program year to year, they're going to function the same way and they're going to have similar load reductions. Even though your full set of commercial customers are much more heterogeneous, you do still have the same customers that are enrolled year to year, and we see those similar reductions across the years. And so I think that brings us to the discussion and recommendations slide, and then we can kind of jump into the questions. But I think we found some things to be true across the last couple years of the SDP program. So obviously SDP has the capability to deliver very large magnitude reductions in loads. And again, it's a very fast ramp rate, right? Because it's just the AC cycling switch and tends to deliver larger reductions when the weather is more extreme and the resources are needed the most. Because we see the enrollment forecast kind of drop in the future, we may start to think that the program is getting small, but I think it's worth pointing out that as of currently, there's still roughly 1 million tons of air conditioning load in the summer discount plan program. And so it's still large, it's still able to deliver these large reductions across these extreme conditions. And this kind of leads to the next point. SDP resources have been declining in recent years. This attrition has coincided with lower incentive rates and a higher number of events. I believe it was in 2020 where there was a large number of events and there was some customer fatigue that happened from that. I think 2022 has proven that the SDP program, even in extreme weather, can be dispatched in a way to help try to mitigate customer fatigue for participating in the program. On the right-hand side, we have our recommendations that we've developed throughout the process of doing the ex post and the ex ante for the SDP residential and commercial side of things. So the first one is to develop a time temperature matrix to address the differences between operations and planning conditions. And that's something that actually we've been working with Edison to kind of get moving and to get rolling, and so that there's a more dynamic feature that people can kind of look at to understand how demand reductions can happen on a given day, at a given temperature, or a given hour, and kind of get deeper into the weeds more than ex ante gets on that. Again, because we saw that Labor Day event on a holiday, which was a little bit odd because we've never seen something like that before, we think it's important to add weekend events to the call so that we can include these weekend test events and kind of forecast going forward what these would look like. Because right now, primarily, we have weekday events, and so it's hard to forecast what we would see on a holiday or a weekend for those future planning conditions. And so one of those recommendations may just be dispatching a weekend event as a test. Additionally, it's important in this program to do these test event operations. Those events that were in June and July of this year, obviously, those are still very important event days, but there wasn't the level of emergency we saw in September. And so those are very useful for us to look at to kind of understand the full capability of load reductions for this program and how it fluctuates when the temperatures might not be nearly as hot. And then it's important to understand the variation in program performance for these different subgroups, especially the regional subgroups. It's important to understand how customers may kind of respond differently on a given event day, because it is important to mitigate fatigue of these customers. It acknowledges that these groupings are different, and it helps us to get a better understanding of how, if these regional subgroups are dispatched independently, how they would be able to perform for those future planning conditions. So with that, this brings us to the question side of things. I'm happy to address anything. I know there was some back and forth discussion in the chat. And so I don't know if I caught all of that. So if there's anything I missed there too, I'm happy to answer that.
I think we have a question from Alok who has raised his hand.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I actually have a couple of questions. So when you say regional subgroup, I'm wondering if that's the same thing as how Edison would define a resource ID for the purpose of bidding into the CAISO market. And so if you could confirm that, and so would it be the case that within a resource ID, you are mixing customers with different cycling strategies?
So I think I'm not sure if I fully understand the first part of your question, but the second part of the question I can answer first. To kind of say that yes, within so that regional subgroup, as I kind of referred to it throughout the presentation, is those load control groups. And yeah, there is a mix of different cycling strategies within those groups, although you cannot dispatch the different cycling strategies independently. You can only dispatch the load control groups independently of each other.
Yeah, I understood that. And could somebody on Edison's side confirm that these groups are the same thing as resource IDs?
Look, I don't see anybody from Edison chiming in. I'm 95% sure that they are the same group. I can
Hi, look,
confirm. I should
this
be back
is
a note if needed. Yeah.
this is Mike from SCE. Yes, I can confirm that those are the load control groups that are also used as CAISO resource IDs.
Okay, thank you. I guess my other questions were, when you were talking about this notch thing, I just wanted to confirm that in terms of measurement, we're still talking about hourly meter reads, right? There's nothing more granular than the hourly reads. And let me just ask the last question. Could we go over what are the explanations for forecasting a decline going forward? I mean, I understood the 2020 attrition, but looking forward, if you can just explain what's the basis for forecasting a decline in enrollment. But yeah, as far as the measurement, could you confirm the measurement? Is it still hourly meters?
Yeah, so that's what we use for this evaluation is hourly data. So when I kind of mentioned like the notches, what I'm getting at is twofold. So one being events where customers aren't dispatched for the full hour, we won't see as drastic of a load reduction in that hour on the graph per se, because we are looking at those hourly reads. And so I think it's something to just kind of keep important in our minds.
Okay, then on the forecast?
Yeah. Edison, do you guys have any comments on kind of why the forecast for the enrollments is expected to decline?
So I would say that this is just the trend that we've been seeing over the past, I think since 2014, the program has been declining. The majority of our unenrollments from the program are results of just turnoffs in general. But then we also have a portion of those unenrollments that are due to calling events frequently and for long durations. And so those combined have led to just more attrition than people joining the program.
There's no attrition. Is none of this attributed to customers switching from load switches to thermostats?
It could be, but I don't have those numbers specifically.
Okay.
But yeah, that's something to consider is switching programs because dual enrollment's not allowed.
Right. Okay, thank you. I'm done.
Awesome. Thank you for your questions.
We also have a question from Amy Wong.
Hi, good morning. I just wanted to make one comment and Mike can, sorry, this is Amy Wong from Southern California Edison. Mike can confirm that, when a customer does de-enroll from the SDP program, we do try to, instead of losing that customer, we do try to offer or let the customer know about the thermostat program if they have, and the technology. So it- to his point, getting those types of statistics about customers that switch from SDP to SEP because they don't want their air conditioner switched off versus um, us reaching out to them saying like, we understand you've unenrolled from this program, but we have this other program that you may be interested in. It will be difficult to identify those numbers. I just wanted to make that statement, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so if I can just follow up on that, Amy. I mean, the forecast sort of seems to presume a static group that's always going to decline. I mean, Edison is still doing marketing, so aren't we getting new enrollments? And maybe we need to look at the incentive design where customers realize that for every event they're getting some compensation.
Alok, some of this, I mean, most of the transition that you see is probably people moving from one home to another versus opt-outs. By far, the opt-out component that's biggest is the move-outs rather than event opt-outs. In the big picture, I mean, the program for the thermostats is growing and the AC cycling program is getting smaller over time. So the two are kind of have a transition going on overall. Now, I think there is a general question as to whether or not you want to keep AC cycling program ongoing in the long run, or grow it over time, because AC cycling does perform differently than thermostats. You typically can get bigger reductions that are sustained for longer periods, but again, like the thermostat has the advantage of people are installing them anyhow. So, so it's a question there, but you really have to look at the enrollment in the context of what's going on with the thermostats, because thermostats enrollments are growing in conjunction with the decline.
Then any for the Edison folks, any reaction to looking at incentive design instead of just having a fixed enrollment incentive, have some portion that depends on event participation?
Are you talking about the Smart Energy Program or SDP?
I'm talking about STP.
Okay. I don't think we offer the enrollment, the sign up bonus anymore, but Mike can confirm.
Yes, that's correct. We stopped offering it this year.
Are you saying customers get no incentive on summer discount plan?
They get the monthly bill credit, but they don't get like a sign up bonus. That was part of the summer reliability proceeding, where the commission asked us to make proposals to increase DR enrollment. And so in that proceeding was where SCE proposed to offer customers, I believe it was a $50 sign up bonus if they signed up for the summer discount plan program. But that was just for 21 and 22. So because that was just for a limited time only, they can still receive obviously the monthly bill credit, but there's no sign up bonus. The sign up bonus is really more a summer smart energy program, excuse me.
And the monthly bill credit is like a fixed amount for the duration of the summer season, right?
For the 4 months, correct.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm not seeing any other questions. So thank you very much, Savannah. All right, and with that, I will open us up to any questions that anyone may have for any of the presentations that we have seen today. And seeing and hearing none. Thank you all for coming today to the IOU Workshop Day 1. We will be returning tomorrow at 9 a.m. to go over the statewide IOU programs, as well as Southern California Energy's Smart Energy Program. So I will see you all tomorrow at 9.
Thank you. Bye.